Okay, we're going to get started, so I don't want to hold up. I believe this is an hour. Am I correct, Anna?
Yes.
Okay. This is a super important topic, and I want to thank everybody who is joining us. Again, let me repeat that for those who may miss the webinar, or you know someone who absolutely needs to know what's going to be said today, we will be sharing out the presentation. My name is Lisa Soren, president of the Bronx Chamber of Commerce, and I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming one of our best partners during this whole pandemic, the staff from Arnold and Porter. If it's okay with them, I'm just going to do a brief names because I can see them here. If I pronounce your name wrong, I apologize. But these are the specialists behind what we're about to discuss and so many other topics. They've been so helpful with the PPP loans and some of the programs that the federal government has released. They've also done one-on-ones with some of our membership. So we are extremely grateful to you and your team for helping out our Bronx businesses. So today we will be hearing from, first of all, Lucy McMillan, who has been a fabulous partner to us and our connection. And there's nobody who answers emails faster than Lucy. That's a kudos to you. We have Susan Hendrickson. I apologize if I don't pronounce your name correctly. Susan, thank you. Paul, I'm going to leave it at Paul. How's that? There you go. We have Jamie Lee, Mirlax. Okay, good. And David Crane. This is a team of experts who will be walking through the restaurant revitalization fund. This is free money. Let me make that straight. Free money. Please share out this information with the colleagues as more people come on board. I will turn it over to who's taking first shot at this from the Arnold and Porter team.
I'll go first.
Very good. Thank you so much. I'm going to sign off and then I will come back on. But thank you all again from the bottom of our hearts. The Bronx is lucky to have you.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for joining us. Just to introduce myself briefly, like Lisa said, my name is Mayor Lax. I'm a senior associate in Arnold and Porter's Corporate and Finance Group based here in New York. Thank you all for joining us for this very important topic. We know it's been a very difficult year for so many people, especially financially for restaurants and food establishments that have had to struggle with close downs and other rules and regulations that have limited your ability to operate and to make money. We know the government has passed a number of programs to help businesses that are struggling financially through COVID. But this one is important. It's the first time that they've done something that is specifically targeting restaurants and bars and food establishments. And it could be very important to you if you own something like that. It can help you really make up a lot or most of the revenue that you lost in 2020 if you're eligible. This is a very new law, and the SBA is still issuing guidance and regulations on it. So it will develop over time. But we've assembled a team that has dug into what is available as of now, and we are excited to give you an overview of the program, some insight into how to apply, and answer some of your questions. We're really happy that you guys have joined us. It is important to get, I think, early information about this program because it's on a first come, first served basis. So as soon as it opens up to applications, which it has not yet, you want to have a jump start and be ready as soon as possible to get your application in. And hopefully we can help you get there get a little bit of a head start with this presentation. With that, I am going to introduce David Crane, who is an associate also in our corporate and finance group in New York. He is going to introduce us to the Restaurant Revitalization Fund program, talk a little bit about how to obtain the grant and the sizes of the grant that you're eligible for. David, why don't you get the slides up on the screen and we can start walking through it.
Well, my name is David Crane. I'm a new associate at Arnold and Porter.
also in the corporate and finance group. Hopefully today we can go through and give you a little bit of help in figuring out how to best navigate the Restaurant Relief Fund. So first, what is the fund? The fund was established as part of the $1.9 trillion stimulus plan back in January. And part of that 1.9 trillion, 28.6 billion of it is being used to create a fund from which grants will be made to food establishments that have suffered revenue losses because of the COVID pandemic. Now, many of you may have experience with the Paycheck Protection Program or the Shuttered venue operator grants. Those and this program will be administered by the Small Business Administration. So some of you may have some familiarity with dealing with them. So as noted, these grants will be used to cover revenue loss due to the COVID-19 pandemic. These grants do, however, have they must be spent on certain permitted uses. These permitted uses are broad, but you do have to keep that in mind when using them. Additionally, if there is any funds that remain unused as of March 11th, 2023, or in the very unfortunate instance that your business may cease operations before then, any funds that remain unused at that point in time must be returned. As Maya noted, these grants will be given out on a first come, first served basis. So you do want to make sure you get your applications in early. Additionally, there are certain priorities that will be noted. Now, as far as what entities are eligible, as you may see from the slides, it's a very broad range of businesses. Restaurants, food stands, food carts, caterers, bars, lounges. Generally speaking, if your business is one where people are gathering mainly for food or drink, you will fall under the categories of eligible entities. However, it's important to note that there are certain entities that are not eligible, such as state and local government-owned businesses, businesses that, along with any affiliates, have more than 20 locations. If you have applied for or have received a Shuttered Venue Operators Grant, which are given out to venues that are primarily for live entertainment, concert halls are the most notable. You're not eligible, and publicly traded companies are not eligible. But by and large, the categories for eligible entities are much, much greater than those that are not eligible.
So just to back up, sorry to jump in, I want to point out one thing. In case you are wondering, I know there are organizations and companies that do multiple things that, sell gas and food, and you may be wondering if you're eligible. The SEA has put out some guidance about this, but you have to keep in mind it has to be your primary business, has to be for people to come and assemble inside to eat and drink. So if you're a convenience store that sells prepackaged sandwiches, you probably will not be eligible. If you have specific questions about it, we'll be happy to address it at the end.
Now, the grant size for most entities, it will generally be the amount by which your gross receipts in 2020 were less than your gross receipts in 2019. Additionally, the amount of the grant that you're eligible for will be reduced by the amount of any Paycheck Protection Program loan that you have received. Now, if your business began operations after January 1st of 2019, there will be different calculations to determine your gross receipts for that year. By and large, it will be the amount of your gross receipts over the time that you were in operations, prorated over the length of the full year. Now, in addition to that grant size limit, there are additional limits of $5 million per location and $10 million for an applicant inclusive of all affiliated businesses. Now, a brief description of an affiliate business is one where the applicant either owns 50% or more, has a right to at least 50% of the profits, or has the right to control. And you look to whether any of these factors existed as of March 13th of 2020. Now, many of you might have multiple locations where your business serves food or conducts its sales. The application is going to ask how many locations you have, and your answer will be dependent on whether you conduct your sales from a permanent location or whether you conduct your sales from sort of a mobile operation, such as a food truck or a food cart. If you do have a permanent structure from which you make your sales, then you're going to count each permanent location where you conduct your sales from. Each one will be an individual location, and you'll have to list each address. However, if you operate mobile food trucks, food carts, or you're a caterer, you will count only the address of your business headquarters. So you only have one location to list on the application. We have a few examples here of multiple locations. So let's say that ABC Company owns 3 restaurants that each have their own EIN and each file their own federal income tax returns. Because each of these restaurants are separate entities, they must file separate funding applications. Another example, let's say that XYZ Company owns 3 restaurants. None of the 3 restaurants operate separately under its own EIN, and XYZ Company files federal income tax returns that include gross receipts and expenses from all 3 restaurants. Because all 3 restaurants are linked as one entity, XYZ must file one application that includes the funding for all 3 restaurants. Now, last example, let's say that HIJ Company owns 3 restaurants under the same EIN. HIJ opened its first location in 2015, the second location in July 2019, and the third location in June 2020. This application will allow HIJ to calculate the potential fund amount for each location using the different calculations, and then combine that amount for a total potential funding amount for all 3 locations.
So just to jump in again, sorry to keep making you back up. I just want to point out how important this is. This slide seems a little like a lot of information on it. But the number of locations, the way you count them, is going to affect you in some important ways. First of all, if you have too many locations, more than 20, you may not be eligible for the grant. But also how many locations you count affects how much money you can get, because you can get, up to a certain amount, up to $5 million per location. So you want to keep that in mind when applying for your grant. So this, for example, if you have 30 food trucks, but one base principal office, you will still be eligible for the grant. But you'll only get a grant for one location. So these are, important things to keep in mind, and we're happy to walk you through any specific questions about how to count those.
As I noted earlier, the grants must be used for only certain permitted purposes, but these permitted purposes are very broad. So you don't keep in mind these purposes, but they're not overly restrictive as far as preventing the grant from being very useful. They can be used for things ranging from payroll costs to paying mortgage obligations, to rent payments, utility, maintenance expenses, but also things such as regular operational expenses or paid sick leave. It's a very broad category of uses, and you shouldn't be afraid that you won't be able to use the grant for the permitted purposes. Now, as noted, by and large, the grants will be awarded on a first come, first served basis. They'll be awarded in the order that the applications are received. However, there are two priority categories to note. First, the first 60 days, there's going to be reserve of funds, primarily to ensure that small businesses will be able to get the necessary grants. So to that effect, there'll be $5 billion reserved for entities with gross receipts during 2019 of no more than $500,000. So small businesses shouldn't worry about being unable to get the grants, at least for the first 60 days. For the first 21 days, in addition, priority will be given to women or veteran-owned small businesses and to socially or economically disadvantaged small businesses. During the application process, if you are seeking to get priority under this category, you will be asked to self-certify this on the application. Now, to meet the requirement to be owned by to be woman or veteran-owned or owned by a socially economic disadvantaged small business, that means that first, at least 51% must be owned by one or more women, veterans, or socially economically disadvantaged individuals, and that the management and daily operations must be controlled by these individuals. Now, note that you don't need 51% to be owned by any single category. So, for example, let's say that an applicant has 5 owners who each own 20% of the applicant. 2 owners are veterans, 1 owner is a socially and economically disadvantaged individual. The SBA will consider this applicant to meet the requirement that at least 51% of the applicant is owned by a priority group, meaning that in this case, they added together the percent that was owned by the veterans and the percent that was owned by the socially and economically disadvantaged people to come up with the greater than 51%. Now just reminder, as outside of these priority categories, it's first come, first serve. So it's greatly important for you to make sure you have your application ready and that you'll be able to, so that you can have it ready to submit as soon as they open.
So just to point out a few things here. Number one, it's important to keep in mind that you cannot, for purposes of getting in this priority grant group, for example, just give your business over to your wife and have her own it on paper in order to become part of the priority. She would actually also have to manage the business. It has to be both. But also, even if you are in one of these priority groups, the funds in these priority groups are limited, and you will be in line on a first come, first serve basis with everybody else in that priority group. So if you are in one of these priority groups, we still encourage you to get your application in quickly and as soon as possible, because you'll be weighed against all the other applicants in that group.
Now, the application process itself. So applicants will have to certify for 2 things on their application process. First, that it's because of the uncertainty and the ongoing pandemic conditions that make the grant necessary for your business to continue operations. In addition, you'll have to certify that you have neither received nor applied for a shuttered venue operator grant, which are grants specifically for generally live entertainment venues such as concert halls.
Right.
Now, there are some documents that we know will be required as part of the application process. There's the SBA form 3172, the application itself. There's the verification for tax information, IRS form 4506T, documentation of your gross receipts. And for those venues that aren't entirely providing food and drink, you might need to provide documents that at least 1/3 of your gross receipts were from food and drink. As we mentioned previously, it's the first come, first serve. So it's best to start getting these documents filled out now, obtain the documents for your gross receipts, have them all on hand, just so that you're not scouring your records for them after the applications have opened up.
All right, just to jump in here for a minute, Jamie, do you want to weigh in a little bit on the application and what we're expecting?
Yeah,
and what's
I was just
available?
about to. Thanks. Thanks for that. Just to add a little bit to what David's saying here. So on the right, you can see this flow chart, very simple, but it just tells you that there's 3 different ways that you can apply. One thing that's unique to this program, so if you are familiar with things like the economic injury disaster loans or the Paycheck Protection Program, you may already be familiar with how the SBA does applications on their online site or through the telephone. The Restaurant Revitalization Fund has an additional method, I would say, for applying, which is through one of their point of sale restaurant partners. And so these are usually technology companies who you may already be doing business with to handle your sales, to handle your accounting and things like that. And so some of these, I'm going to say now, not all of them yet, but I think SBA is working to try to get as many partners as possible. But some of these tech companies have partnered with the SBA to make it easier for you to apply. So they'll have their own portal, and you can choose to apply through that portal through your partnership already with one of your vendors there. It will usually be able to process all your data automatically based on the information that you've already provided to them in the past. The other ways, of course, are you can apply online through their application, or you can apply via the phone. I will say now, I think this is something that we've already mentioned before, the application and the portal are not currently live. We'll talk at the very end here about when we expect those things to come into play and when we expect them to open. But just know for now that what you can get your hands on is a sample application. And it is pretty much what the final is going to look like. It's about 15 or so pages, but a lot of it is just some extra information. It's going to ask you, ownership information. What type of establishment are you? Do you have prior PPP loans? It's going to walk you through step by step the calculation for the grant amount. It'll also ask you about priority eligibility, and then it'll start to get into some of that documentation that David was mentioning. And SBA Form 3172, just so you know, that's the application. That's what it's going to be called from here on out. So the other thing will be there's a smattering of certifying statements that you're going to have to make. So you want to make sure that you're in a position that you can certify all of these statements, things like you're going to use them all for eligible purposes, or you are an eligible business, these kinds of things. Also saying, no, I did not apply or receive a Shuttered venue operator grant, or I am not currently applying for, another PPP loan on top of all of this. So just wanted to add that information there, but I'll turn it back now, I think, to Paul to go on to the next slides.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I didn't get a chance to introduce her. Jamie is an associate in our legislative and public policy group in DC. And as you can tell, she is all over all of this type of stuff. And really great to have on the team. Now I'd like to introduce Paul. Paul is an associate also in our corporate and finance group in New York. We have a number of us on the call. A number of you probably or may have interacted with the SBA and some of their other programs in the last year, SBA or some of their other grant program, PPP or some of their other grant programs. Paul is going to walk us through a little bit on kind of the comparisons and how these programs interact with each other. Paul, it's all yours.
Cool, thanks, Mayor. So as Mayor said, we have the new Restaurant Revitalization Fund grants. And I think, as we were going through and reading the bill, I think some of the questions that were coming up from us was, we have this new program, but there have been other programs, and how do they all kind of fit in and interact with each other? So as kind of a quick recap, we've now been in this pandemic for, a year and several months. And over the course of this pandemic, the federal government has provided several relief programs for small businesses, and that are administered by the SBA. This includes the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Disaster Loans, and the Shuttered Venue Operator Grant. And so we wanted to just cover briefly, how these programs interact with each other, because it's very likely that you probably have applied for one or several of these before, and you may be considering applying for a restaurant revitalization fund grant as well. So first, what happens if you have a PPP loan? Now, under the bill, you can have a PPP loan and a restaurant revitalization fund grant at the same time. However, the amount of the grant will be reduced by the amount of your PPP loan. Now, the overall kind of concept that's going on here is that the federal government just doesn't want you to double dip into multiple programs. And so if you, let's say, for example, let's say you had a PPP loan of $50,000 and you would have been eligible for a restaurant revitalization fund grant of $75,000. What the bill says now is, well, you can only get a restaurant revitalization fund grant of $25,000 now, so that the total amount that you're eligible for remains the same. What happens if you have a shuttered venue operator grant? Under the bill, if you have a pending application for, or you've received a shuttered venue operator grant, you are not eligible for a restaurant revitalization fund grant. And this is kind of the federal government kind of coming in and saying, we're going to kind of draw a line in the sand. And so with the shuttered venue operator grants, there was similarly a portion of that program that said you really had to be a live, like a live entertainment venue in order to be eligible for that. And so likewise with the restaurant revitalization fund grants, you really have to be a restaurant in order to be eligible for that. So it's making sure that, depending on the type of business you operate, you're getting the funds that you're entitled to. And then third, what happens if you have an idle? So you can have an idle and a restaurant revitalization fund grant at the same time, and it does not reduce that grant amount. Next slide, please. And so because you can have a restaurant revitalization fund grant and a PPP loan at the same time, we wanted to cover what some of the differences were between them. And part of this has to do with the fact that it's not just that you can have them both at the same time, but with PPP2 that recently came out, it's possible that you have not only applied for a second PPP loan, but it's possible you're thinking of applying for a PPP loan as well. So you may have a decision to make. And so some of the differences are, one, a PPP loan is a loan that turns into a grant once you use it for permitted purposes. On the other hand, a restaurant revitalization fund grant is a grant that you can only be compelled to return if you don't spend it on the permitted purposes on time. And maybe one of the, that may sound like it's about the same thing, but I think one of the other important differences to note here is that with the PPP program, you have 24 weeks. With a restaurant revitalization fund grant, you have a lot longer. And so that's something to consider there. Two, the amount of a PPP loan is based off of your payroll costs. On the other hand, the amount of a restaurant revitalization fund grant is based on your gross receipts. Now, this kind of goes directly at the hearts of both of these programs. So the Paycheck Protection Program, not to editorialize too much, but the Paycheck Protection Program in a lot of ways was more like an unemployment insurance plan that was kind of running through companies to prevent companies from terminating employees during the height of the pandemic. A restaurant revitalization fund grant, really is there to make up for lost revenue between 2020 and 2019. And so depending on what your operating leverage may be, the amount that you're eligible for a restaurant revitalization fund grant may be more than what you were eligible for under the PPP. And so that's something else to consider. Three, PPP loans were administered through a bank or other financial institution. On the other hand, restaurant revitalization fund grants are administered directly by the SBA or through a recognized SBA restaurant partner. So I think we all remember at the height of the Paycheck Protection Loan panic, it was, where do I get it? what happens if my bank doesn't approve me for a PPP loan? Can I open another account? And if you open another account, you had to go through all of the banking regulations and all of the questionnaires. And so all of that is not happening with the Restaurant Revitalization Fund grants. Here you can go directly through the SBA and hopefully eliminate an intermediary. And last, and this probably won't affect everybody, but the affiliation rules for PPP loans was determined or used the SBA's existing affiliation rules. So if you ever had to deal with those, you probably recall them being a little bit complex, a little bit convoluted, and if you just have a small restaurant or maybe 2 or 3 locations, they're just difficult to get through. The affiliation rules for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund program simply says that you're an affiliate if you're a business that is an eligible entity and has an equity or right to profit distributions of not less than 50% of the applicant or the contractual authority to control the direction of the applicant as of a specific date. And so this is overall a much simpler definition. It's a little bit more concrete and it's a lot easier to apply. And I would say a much more classical and less convoluted than the affiliation rules under the SBA's 7A loan program. Next slide, please. And so last, we wanted to talk about what the permitted uses of a Restaurant Revitalization Fund grant are compared to that of a PPP loan. And so we've put out this table, and we think that there's substantial overlap, but also a couple of differences. And so you can see that for the most part, payroll costs are still there. Mortgage payments are still there, although under a Restaurant Revitalization Fund grant, you can use it for the principal portion of a mortgage payment, not just the interest portion. Rent's still there, utilities are still there, supplier costs for goods essential to the business are still there. We have supplies, including protective equipment and cleaning materials, and maintenance for outdoor seating, which we think probably has a little bit of overlap, even if it's not the same, with worker protection expenditures to comply with COVID health requirements. We have some operational expenses, which we expect would have some overlap. And then under the Restaurant Revitalization Fund grants, we also have food and beverage expenses and paid sick leave. So, much more permitted uses under the Restaurant Revitalization Fund, but notwithstanding still a lot of overlap. So, yeah, so well targeted towards restaurants. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Jamie to talk about what's next and what to expect. Jamie?
Thanks, Paul. So as I mentioned before, at the moment, what we have is a unopened program. However, SBA just announced, maybe in like the last day or so, that they are working to get this program up and running. They've got a soft 2-week period. I'm going to say it. I'm not going to commit the SBA to a certain date or anything because they haven't committed to one yet either. What they are planning to do is they're going to establish a 7-day pilot period sometime over the next couple of weeks to try to work out any technical tweaks with the application portal before they get this thing up and running. As I mentioned before, you can check out the sample application online. So what you see here is the SBA's web page for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. And on there, you're able to sign up to get alerts for whenever new information comes out, including when the fund actually becomes available. I highly recommend signing up so that you can get notified as soon as possible. Like we've been saying, many times on this presentation, first come, first serve. And whether you're in the priority bucket or not, whatever bucket you're in, it's going to be a first come, first serve. So we highly recommend just, staying signing up and staying notified. The next things that'll come after this, we expect that they're going to finalize the application, although at this point it is pretty much finalized. There's a program guide, not quite the same as we've seen with regulations with some of the other SBA programs, but it does go pretty in depth. It answers a lot of questions. They've also got FAQs up on their website that you can check out that cover a lot of very specific questions. Things like, what happens if I own X number of businesses and X number of restaurants? Then what's my situation? And the SBA has done its best to try to answer those questions ahead of time. And like we also mentioned before, certain groups will get priority. So it's great to know if you're in that group, you'll get priority the first 21 days, although technically you're allowed to apply at any time. It's just that if you're in priority, you'll get considered then. If you are not part of the priority groups, then you will be considered first come, first serve once the 21-day period is over. The other thing I do want to note, is obviously this was a federal program mandated by Congress. There could certainly still be tweaks as things come along down the road, but I would just say this, it's probably going to be like this for a while before we see any major changes. So just so you all know what timeline looks like on the federal level.
Thanks, Jamie. Can you just remind us what the web address is for them to go and sign up?
Yes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put it in the chat for everybody
Thank you.
so that you all can see. Thank you. Okay. All right. So if everyone sees that, it's sba.gov/restaurants. Very easy to remember. And then on there, you can sign up to get information. This is where all the info currently is being posted.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you to our panelists. With that, we are happy to open up the floor to any questions anybody has about this program. If you have a question, feel free to put it up in our Q&A section, and someone will read your question, and we will do our best to respond to it.
So we do have one question on here. Shahzad Mir, he's asking, our locations are lowered to between 25% to 30%. Your Plumbifier are stating at least 33% to start with. Are we eligible, or does it need to be at least 33%? Please guide us.
So I can, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know if I was.
I don't know. That's
Okay, I can take that question. So I'm going to start off by saying I understand that every situation is unique and every calculation can be very different. So first thing that I would really press to you is to see if you can try to speak with the SBA. There's a hotline that you can find on that web address that I provided that you can get questions answered by SBA representatives. There's also a district office. There's one in Lower Manhattan, and they are usually local experts, but they are members and representatives of the SBA. So they're getting information from their agency as it's coming out. So highly recommend doing that. In general, though, the rule is there are certain establishments that are sort of thought to be automatically included. Automatically, they meet the eligibility requirements. Things like restaurants, things like bars. There are items that are just presumed to meet the eligibility threshold. And then there are certain establishments that aren't. And so if you fall into one of those categories, the question becomes, according to SBA's program guide, do you have on-site sales of food and beverage that are 33%, at least 33% of your gross receipts? And so if that's the case, then I'm going to say you may be eligible. But of course, that's a calculation that you're going to need to think about, what do your sales look like? And there's a few examples in the SBA's FAQs that could be helpful. So one example that I thought was certainly very interesting is, what happens if I'm let's say, one example that SBA gives, let me say it, I'll read it verbatim for you guys so I don't mess this up. Would a snack store that sells prepackaged foods qualify for the fund? What about a convenience store that sells hot prepared food items? According to SBA's FAQs, which were just updated, says no, these types of businesses are not eligible for RRF. for the Restaurant Revitalization Fund. So that's just one example, but they've got a few others up on the website as well.
Yeah, and to kind of add to that, we when the bill is talking about the eligible entities, at the very end, it kind of leaves this kind of catch-all theme of, I think its primary purpose is for the gathering to eat food or drink. And so I think that's a theme to kind of keep in mind as to whether you are a restaurant or not.
Okay, so there's another one here. Somebody would like to have you state the 21-day time frame situation.
Sure. So if you are a business that is majority owned and managed by a woman, by a veteran, or by people that fall within an economically disadvantaged group, you will receive priority to receive funds from this program in the first 21 days after it opens. So if 1,000 people apply and 10 of them fall into one of those categories, those 10 will get the grants first. The important thing to keep in mind is that it should not slow you down from sending in your application. If you fall into one of those categories, you will still be measured on a first come, first served basis against all the other woman, veteran, and economically disadvantaged businesses. So it'll get you in line ahead of everybody else, but not ahead of the people that fall into your group.
So there's currently no questions right now, but like Lisa stated earlier, this video webinar is recorded and will be shared out through our YouTube channel and also through our social medias.
I know we received some questions in advance. Do we want to go through some of those?
Yeah, so if you were answered already, like the bodegas who serve hot food, we already established that answer. There was a few, like, our insurance costs covered under this grant.
The answer is some. Some are. There is a list, and I could certainly bore you all with it now, but it's also listed on that website. There are certain types, especially things like group health benefits, those are covered. And so certain insurance payments are going to be covered, including their, and that'll be for their premiums.
Okay.
And to add to that too, is that the definition for payroll costs is the exact same definition of payroll costs as was in the Paycheck Protection Program. So any type of that, like employee benefits, that even if it's not, even if it doesn't count as insurance, it may count as payroll costs. So to look at that as well.
Okay. There was another question here. Can a restaurant apply if they don't have any payroll?
The answer to that, I think, is yes. There are the real calculations here is if they experience any revenue loss in 2020. If your revenue went down from when I was in 2019, you can get money. And there are a whole bunch of expenses you can spend it on. Payroll is just one of them. If you don't have payroll, there are, as we listed earlier in this presentation, there are a whole bunch of other things you can spend it on.
Okay. So majority of the questions were answered throughout the webinar. Those were the only two, but definitely if there are any questions, you can always email me. I will have my email here in the chat box for everyone. Let's see. Yeah, okay. I get shy during webinars. I think we just got another question. Yes. So the webinar will be sent out to all attendees. It should be sent out by Friday, the latest or the earliest. along with the PowerPoint presentation as well.
All right, if
There we go.
that's everything.
Yeah.
Well, we'd just like to thank everybody for joining us and for attending. I'd like to thank my colleagues for all their excellent hard work putting this together. It really has been our pleasure to walk you through this program. We really hope it will be helpful for you. And here's a page with our names and contact information. Happy to be in touch with any of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure working with you, you guys, and Arnold and Porter, and Lucy, especially Lucy. I've mentioned she's my best friend now.
The feeling is mutual. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining the webinar. Everything will be on our social medias, our website, bronxchamber.org, and our YouTube channel. Make sure to follow all our social medias as we are very active and we have a lot of information coming out as well. So yeah, thank you for joining.
Thank you.
All right.